This is Unrendered on IKTV. You can follow us on Twitter at iConcepts. I have with me Mrs. Indera Sagewan-Alli. She's from the Caribbean Center for Competitiveness. Indera, let's continue to look at your operations, the Center for Competitiveness. You're funded by the IADB, which is the Inter-American Development Bank, and so all these institutions that are putting money into sustainable growth in the Caribbean. And I guess the vision is that the private sector is where that lies. Okay. Now, there are ideological differences to that notion, however, that in the Caribbean you can leave everything to the private sector. You know, there are people who think, yes, just let the private sector run free, you know, and let the market decide. And the ideological differences to that, where there's some people who feel, well, we have to do health, we have to do education, we have to, you know, certain things that must come within the public sector. How do you see it, where you sit in the Center for Competitiveness? How do you see what really should be left to the private sector to be the engine and what should be left to the public sector?
Well, the state really should be the enabler, should be the facilitator to private sector development. And what do I mean by that? They need to create an environment within which the private sector can feel comfortable to operate. Now that covers a gamut of things. It includes, where necessary, providing a regulatory framework within which it operates. It includes ensuring that the bureaucratic machinery of the state operates in a well-oiled manner so that it is not a hindrance to the private sector doing business, but that it allows the private sector to do its business on a timely basis. Yeah, it is about ensuring that the financial sector within which the private sector operates in terms of access and financing is regulated in a way to ensure that it is stable and solid, so that because you know something happens in the financial services sector and it really renders the entire economy, it puts it in a bad place, as we've seen happen globally with respect to the most recent financial crisis. So that there is a role for the public sector in the development and growth of the private sector. What we have in the region, though, is a state-driven sector that doesn't seem to understand its role. And it really has too much of a heavy hand in the business of the private sector. In many instances, they act to crowd out the private sector. And they do it badly. They do it inefficiently. And we end up in some situations which are,
so give me some examples of what you're talking about.
Some examples to which, I'll use Trinidad and Tobago as the example, yeah? I think Caribbean Airline is one of those areas where the state's hand in it has now seen us to the point where we're in a second incarnation of a state-owned and operated airline, and for the second time, we're in some significant trouble where the airline is operating, in the red. And we're seeing where, even though there's now the removal of the fuel subsidy, there's a significant equity need for a significant.
So it's going to be refinanced. So
if we talk here, we could possibly even talk about LIAT.
Yes.
Now I want to be more careful when I speak to LIAT because LIAT by and large services a set of very small islands, and the extent to which you can create, you can ensure that there is the ease of transportation between and amongst these islands and from these islands in the rest of the world is certainly things that we need to consider, and we need to consider carefully.
As much as you brought it up, let's look at the model of transportation, right? You're talking about air transportation. I'm going to get back to that. Let's roll it back to ground transportation, where there are government-run, as in the case of Barbados, right? Barbados, the government buses there. Trinidad, TTC,
Yes.
I think it is. Is it TTC? I can't remember.
PTSD.
PTS, right, Public Transport Corporation, right. Are those in fact subsidized?
Absolutely.
Right.
We have a fast ferry that, and this is now, you know, a supplement to the ground transportation from San Fernando to Port of Spain. That is, the subsidy is phenomenal.
Yeah.
You know, and so the state gets involved. Now the state has a responsibility to ensure that you have a ground transportation network that is very effective. In other parts of the world, what you go for is a least cost approach to it, where you're looking for providing a subsidy that is as minimal as you possibly can. We do not, for example, take the country and break it up into zones where we look at where the high traffic is and we look at the more rural areas. And instead we run these huge buses off-peak times, you know, which
So it's
are just
inefficient.
a few bit,
It's
it's
inefficient.
highly inefficient. Instead of saying, okay, I run this fleet during peak time, and that's subsidized, but off-peak, I probably, and here are opportunities to engage with the private sector and allow the private sector to do it. And if the private sector is unable to do it efficiently, where the state can come in simply to make up the difference.
Yeah.
So you offer a subsidy that is based on the difference between the private supplier being able to provide this at a loss and provide it and at making a decent standard.
But the underlying thing, and why I brought up the ground transport, because I want to get back to the air transport, right? I want to establish a principle here, because what's underlying subsidies of ground transportation is because the governments want to ensure that people can move from point A to B to C to D and get the economy going, get to work, get back from work, okay? So that's important. Now, let's raise that a level to air transport. And as much as you brought up Liat, do you think that is the same principle?
To some extent it
At
is,
work,
because I think it is important that you have
there's no excuse for the inefficiencies, mind you.
No,
right?
and I mean, we could talk about the inefficiencies.
Yes.
I myself, I have suffered at the hands of Liat's inefficiencies over the last, particularly this year, and they have been significant. The very poor customer service, the lack of accountability to the traveling consumer. You know, Liat has a policy where it is only after 48 hours, if they have not been able to deliver your bag together with you to your destination, that you can claim for any compensation. That presupposes that I have the resources to be able to buy the basic things I need in that 48 hours. You know, and so that we could talk about it. And so that to me is a first step that the shareholders need to address and need to address urgently. I think if it is possible to introduce a level of competition within the space and allow the price to be driven down, I certainly think it is something to be entertained. But you know, we say we need state-owned monopolies in situations where if the private sector comes in and provides the service, the price is going to be prohibitive. I do not claim to have done the analysis to be able to determine if the same thing will apply in terms of air transport, the air transport service that Liat affords. But having a service, I think, is critical, because it facilitates trade. It facilitates the movement of businessmen and women who go from one place to the other in order to engage in it. It facilitates tourism, regional tourism, for example.
Exactly. So it's important to have the connections.
It is very important to have that connectivity.
Right. But what do you suppose is the reason why the shareholder governments of Liat are reluctant to engage
to open it up to competition?
To open it up to competition.
Again, I don't want to talk out of turn or to talk without the information. So that, and that to me is the kind of analysis that needs to be done. We need to do an analysis to determine whether there are interested airlines, there are airlines out there who are interested to come. To simply say to do away with Liat and to bring in a private monopoly is certainly not the answer.
It's not the answer,
because we
right.
will move into a situation where, again, the price motive is going
You'll
to
be
drive
held
it.
at the
Right.
ransom.
So we don't
You'll be
want
held to
that.
ransom, yes.
So the analysis needs to be done to determine whether we can have competition, whether the market is large enough, whether demand is large enough to be able to support a more competitive arrangement with respect to that. And if we find that there are a few airlines that are interested and they could give the guarantees with respect to the price, then I certainly think that there is a case for moving in that direction.
My question to you is that, yes, we're talking about it here, but there's a Center for Competitiveness. It's, you know, you're the executive director, and I suppose things like what we're talking about is the mandate that you have. So what's the holdup? Why isn't the Caribbean Center for Competitiveness taking this LIAT issue and engaging the governments and running with it?
Well, the center is very young. It's only 2 years old, okay? So we only, in fact, what we've been doing so far is building capacity to be able to do these things. And that this is where we're at, where we have an amount of capacity built and where we're now only going to start to engage with the governments in terms of doing these kinds of analysis. So in the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, this is not to excuse the center for not addressing the LIAT issue, but you are constrained by your capacity to deliver. You have certain absorptive capacity, and you have to be realistic to that. So my first engagement with the government of St. Vincent and Grenadines has really been in the context of your BAM initiative, where there is resources being provided through the EU to support the growth and diversification of your agricultural sector.
Yes.
And we see that because there are resources available and you are about to do something, the center wants to work with the government, with the sector, to ensure that we don't do the same thing we've been doing wrong for all of these years and we don't have a positive outcome. So I am really trying to engage with the minister, with the PS, with your prime minister to say, look, without understanding very clearly where you want to end up in terms of agriculture, it is impossible to put a hodgepodge of initiatives in place now because you simply have the money and to end up there. So it is one thing to say our fruit and vegetable farmers need small-scale equipment in order to be able to expand their production.
Yeah.
But expand production to what end? Is it that you're simply happy to expand the production of fruit and vegetables for the domestic market because you have a certain degree of importation of that? So is it that you simply want to displace the importation of fruit and vegetables? So you simply want to bring in that equipment to do that? Is it that you want to produce to do that as well as to supply a regional market? Is it that you want to produce for an international market? Because making those kinds of decisions is really what will point you backwards in terms of the size of the equipment that you need, what you want the equipment to do, because that links into the cost of production, into the price that you will be offering your product. To what extent the introduction of this equipment is going to allow me to produce my fruit and vegetables at a price that will compete with the fruit and vegetables that is currently coming into the market and that I'm not able to compete against. So you have to start with the end in mind. How much acreage are you prepared to put into the production of fruit and vegetable? What is the anticipated volume of production you hope to get? Production in what sense? Over half of the year, over a season? Are you going to be planning your production so that you have it right through the year? Are you simply going to produce fresh fruit and vegetables? And there's nothing wrong with that because there's a lot of value that for domestic consumption, for export, or is it that you are
so the whole thing needs proper analysis, and this is where you have been engaged.
This is where the center comes in.
Well, when we come back for our third segment, I want to ask you about, well, I want to kick off that segment with how seriously the governments are going to take you anyway, because, you know, you can come in, they can listen to you, but how seriously do they take you? That's another matter. So let's discuss what your success has been in getting governments to listen to you. This is Unrendered on IKTV. More with Mrs. Indera Sagewan-Alli when we come back.